extremely superstitious, and both savage and skittish, and unpredictable and childlike. I mean, it's these interesting stereotypes. But here's the story that Livy paints, and it involves the great old men of Rome from another time, the ancient ones who are still around with long beards, as he says, after the fashion of their day. They're neither useless mouths nor able to fight in the citadel, so they decide, Livy says, that they're going to set an example by simply sacrificing their lives in the hopes that that somehow maybe helps things with the gods or whatnot. He says these generals from the past who celebrated triumphs a long time ago, and these senators and august people who are now the elders in society, put on their most elaborate and decorated robes of higher office, went to their homes in the posh section of Rome, and sat in their chairs of high office, their ivory chairs, and waited like silent statues for death to find them. Here's how Livy describes the Celts coming into the city of Rome, and it's like a ghost town with the gates open, and they don't know what to do, and they freak out a little bit, and then an incident happens that's wild, that touches off the forest fire of Gallic impetuosity. This, by the way, from the Aubry de Selincourt translation. Here's what Livy writes, quote, "A night having passed without action, the Gauls found their lust for fighting much abated. At no time had they met with any serious resistance, and there was no need now to take the city by assault. When therefore they entered on the following day, it was coolly and calmly enough. The Colline gate was open, and they made their way to the Forum, looking with curiosity at the temples and at the citadel, the only place to give an impression of a city at war. They left a reasonably strong guard in case of attack from the fortified heights, and then dispersed in search of plunder, finding the streets empty. Crowds of them broke into the first houses they came to. Others went farther afield, presuming supposedly that buildings more remote from the Forum would offer richer prizes. But there the very silence and solitude made them uneasy, separated as they were from their companions, and suggested the possibility of a trap. So they soon returned, keeping close together, to the neighborhood of the Forum. Here they found the humbler houses locked and barred, but the mansions of the nobility open. The former they were ready to break into, but it was a long time before they could bring themselves to enter the latter. Something akin to awe held them back at what met their gaze. Those figures seated in the open courtyards, the robes and decorations, august beyond reckoning, the majesty expressed in those grave, calm eyes, like the majesty of gods. They might have been statues in some holy place, and for a while the Gallic warriors stood entranced. Then, on an impulse, one of them touched the beard of a certain Marcus Papirius. It was long, as was the fashion of those days, and the Roman struck him on the head with his ivory staff. That was the beginning. The barbarian flamed into anger and killed him, and the others were butchered where they sat. From that moment no mercy was shown. Houses were ransacked, and the empty shells set on fire." End quote. Whether or not that happened, that's a pretty cool and interesting scene, and a romantic and super Roman patriot like Livy probably saw it that way too. Nonetheless, who knows what sources he was working from. As the story goes on, basically, the Gauls sack Rome, set fire to a bunch of it, and start this siege because they can't take the fortified citadel in the middle. The ancient sources differ on what happens next, but the famous story is that a siege develops. Both sides want to call the siege off. They come to an agreement, 1,000 pounds of gold, right? If the Romans will pay 1,000 pounds of gold, the Gauls will leave. And then as they're weighing the gold out, one of the Romans famously complains that the weights have been doctored with, and the Gauls are falsifying the weights to their advantage. And the king of this tribe walks up to the scale, takes his big heavy sword, throws it on the Gaul side of the scale, and says, "Woe to the vanquished." Meaning, what are you going to do if the weights are loaded in our favor? You lost. Pay up. Now, I was reading a fantastic book on early Rome called War and Society in Early Rome by Jeremy Armstrong. And he floats an idea that a lot of others have floated too. The idea that basically it's this conquering and sacking of the city of Rome, 1,000 years almost before the next time that they will do it, that will create the Rome we all know. What's that line from the Batman series where the Joker says to him, "You made me"? It's the same thing we said with this "woe to the vanquished" line that Livy throws in, right? It's almost like the Romans hundreds of years later saying, hey, you set the rules, so we're playing by them. Woe to the vanquished. This isn't genocide, what we're doing in Celtic land when Julius Caesar conquers all these tribes. This is playing by the rules that you set up when you first conquered us. You made me. And Armstrong points out that the actual sacking of Rome may not have been too terrible because the archaeological evidence doesn't seem to support some, terrible Carthaginian solution type burning to the ground or anything. But for the Romans, that probably wasn't the problem. It was probably a lot more what a lot of the writers who write about the Romans quite a bit point out, that they have this inability to accept defeat and humiliation, and whereas most people probably would write something off and move along with their lives, the Romans fester and focus on things and remember old slights and wounds. And the psychological seeds for that, if not planted, may have been heavily watered as a result of Roman experience after losing to supposedly this first Celtic army they ever fought at the Battle of the Allia, and then seeing their city sacked by them. By the way, I should point out, because I think it's cool, that the old idea that this is a tribe of Celtic people that has shown up to sack Rome is challenged by a lot of historians, and there's people on both sides who suggest that the evidence shows that this may have been a group of hired mercenaries instead, that had been hired by a ruler on the modern-day island of Sicily to fight with him, and that Rome was just on the way, and what the heck, we'll sack it, pick up a couple of extra bucks to eat on the way, while we're doing it. So this idea that what we have here is a tribe may be wrong. And it's kind of important because when Caesar's conquering Gaul hundreds of years later, they'll be talking about, that tribe over there, those are the ones that, sacked our country 340 years ago. Those Romans have long memories. Unfortunately, not just for the Celts, but for everyone. And it's worth pointing out that, in 390, when this battle happens, the Celtic peoples of Europe are very powerful. And they're all over the place. And who they are is a great question. Once upon a time when it was easy to classify these things in ways that sounded easy to understand, but now seem totally ridiculous, they were a race. Celts were a race like Anglo-Saxons were a race, right? I mean, all these, you divide the world into the different racial groups, and these are the yellow people, and these are the black people, and these are the white people. I mean, 100 years ago, you open up a history book, and that's how they do it. As the complexities mounted and that whole way of looking at things went out of fashion 50 years ago, 40 years ago, the Celts are an ethnic group or a people. That's how I grew up, reading a guy like Michael Grant, who, like everyone else, sort of insinuated most of the time that these Celtic people were probably all related by blood. Those people that sacked Rome in 390 BCE are the ancestors of the people in Ireland, 500 years later, or today. Nowadays, that's a pretty tough argument to make, given the way it's seen amongst most of the experts. And I don't mean to speak for them, because this Celtic study stuff is fascinatingly debatable, and the passion with which the experts go at it is fun to watch from the sidelines, but it means you have to be really careful. And there are a lot of people out there who are very passionate about their view of who a Celt is and who is not a Celt. I love the way Barry Cunliffe, who we mentioned earlier, puts it, because it gets me out of all kinds of trouble to say it the way he said it. He said a Celt is a person who believes him or herself to be Celtic. I thought of a T-shirt that I should market. I'm going to make it green, of course, and I'm going to say, Celtic, it's not a nationality, it's a way of life. But the point is the same. The modern view of a lot of the experts on this, and they're archaeologists, linguists, historians, they all kind of look at this and differ, is that what we're looking at here is a culture, a shared culture and similar language, maybe, like blue jeans, rock and roll and beer drinking. It's something that spread sort of in prehistory to a bunch of different peoples, the foundation of which might have been in place since the last ice age, if you think about it. And then over time, succeeding waves of people and immigrants and inmarrying and all that adds layers of spice to the original. But when they do DNA tests today, it's hard to not find lots of people who have been there since, lots of DNA strands that have been there for a very long time, much earlier than the Celtic era in history. In fact, maybe you could look at the entire Celtic period in ancient history in Europe as a fashion era, right? It's the era of bell-bottoms in Europe. I mean, this is an era where a certain culture dominated. If you go 3,000 years before, it's not there. And after Caesar, it's mortally wounded. But truthfully, even if Caesar is the one you could say mortally wounds the Celtic culture, the Romans have been like kryptonite to this culture for a couple hundred years before Caesar. I mean, if you look at a map of where Celtic culture predominates at the time that story happened, we just told you, the sack of Rome in 390 BCE, and where it is after Caesar does what Caesar does, it's some kind of terrible ethnic cleansing. I mean, the Celtic cultures stretch all the way from Portugal on one side. Well, I was going to say to the Balkans, but truthfully, there was a tribe or a group of tribes that went all the way into modern-day Turkey. They were called the Galatians. And they're famous because a couple hundred years after they settle down and go from a 1 or a 2 on the Dan Carlin tribal scale, they're up to a 9 or a 10, and St. Paul will be writing his famous letter to the Galatians. They have found Celtic cultural remains up as far north as like Poland, all around the Hungarian plains, southern Germany, modern Austria, all the way into northern Italy, which is a real Celtic country for a while, and then, of course, all of modern-day France. And whether or not the British Isles and Ireland should fall into this, anybody's guess. A lot of people argue. And let's remember, before you send me an angry letter, a Celt is a person who believes him or herself to be Celtic, right? That's my get-out-of-jail-free card. I love the way, Diodorus Siculus describes the Celts. And by the way, most of these accounts come from the same guy, supposedly, the eyewitness accounts of a person who was an expert in many different subjects, one of the great figures of the ancient world whose writings have not come down to us, a guy named Posidonius. But we don't have his exact work. What we have is whatever he wrote down and put into the local libraries, everybody else used. So we have his eyewitness accounts as told through a bunch of other different people. For example, Diodorus Siculus, who says of these Celtic peoples, describing an ancient culture, something National Geographic today would certainly be cataloging all the time. See, that's who Posidonius is. He's the National Geographic explorer of his day. And through Diodorus Siculus, we hear supposedly what Posidonius saw when he visited Celts. Diodorus writes, quote, "The Gauls are tall of body, with rippling muscles and white of skin, and their hair is blonde, and not only naturally so, but they also make it their practice by artificial means to increase the distinguishing color which nature has given it. For they are always washing their hair in lime water, and they pull it back from the forehead to the top of the head and back to the nape of the neck, with the result that their appearance is like that of satyrs and pans, since the treatment of their hair makes it so heavy and coarse that it differs in no respect from the mane of horses. Some of them shave their beard, but others let it grow a little, and the nobles shave their cheeks, but they let the mustache grow until it covers the mouth." End quote. If you haven't looked at the wonderful art, the Pergamene art that includes this figure called the Dying Gaul, go take a look at it because it's beautiful. But it describes sort of maybe a stereotype, but maybe not, the classic look of these people, the warriors anyway, as just described by Diodorus. They looked like punk rockers, first of all, with the haircut. And you have to imagine the bleach blonde hair that he just described there, because that's what the lime water would have done to it, bleached it like bleach blonde hair. And if you've ever had, like I have before, the bleach blonde hair, it gets all horse mane-like after a while. So this figure in the art is sitting there with like wounds in its side, and remember, it's statue stone color, so you have no colors, but you can see the blood dripping down, and he's holding his wounds and I think it's a broken sword by his side. He's also got a mustache, though. That's not very punk at the time, but the punk haircut, the mustache, and the build is interesting because, it's the difference between the modern weightlifting muscles today and the lithe natural muscles, but he's muscular, but also sort of sinewy and long. And there was actually, the ancient sources say that, at least in the period we're talking about, a lot of these Celtic tribes had rules, and they would fine warriors if your belly drooped over your belt line. So they were required sort of to be in shape, supposedly. This guy is heroically nude, as it's called. And it's hard to figure out because the Romans like portraying barbarians as heroically nude, but they sometimes like portraying themselves heroically nude. So it's hard to figure out what's a convention and what's real. And this may have had religious overtones or other things going on. Nonetheless, some historical evidence to back up the heroically nude concept. But there are multiple incidents that talk about Celtic warriors, especially select groups of Celtic warriors stripping off all their clothes and fighting absolutely nude except for a gold torque around the neck, which is just like a giant armlet or anklet or something, I guess you would describe it. So he's got no clothes on. He's got the punk haircut. He's got the mustache. He looks about 6'5", about 200 pounds of raw muscle, and, naked with the torque around his neck. I'm sorry, visually, it's striking and cool. And if not naked, then you get those wonderful Celtic fashions, right? Supposedly the striped clothing, the checked clothing, what we would call today the plaid clothing.
Of all the communities,
they are wonderfully colorful, interesting, cool people. Add to that the women. See, the Celtic women, once again, we get absolutely shafted by the fact that these Celts did not leave a historical written record that we could get their views on things, and historians had to scrap and try to find any little piece that might help us to understand their personality better in their own words, as opposed to hearing from people who often despised them, certainly belittled them. But, I mean, they thought, for example, in the Mediterranean that Celtic women were beautiful. But I guess you could say maybe the way that you described them today is their attitudes were that they were also uppity and somewhat ferocious. I think sometimes in the descriptions it reminds me of the old stereotype, and it's an old one now, of the housewife and the hen-pecked husband, and the housewife was kind of burly and had a rolling pin in her hand and would smack the husband upside the head sometimes with it. Amongst some of the people out there that are sort of the people that think of the Celts as sort of a new age kind of thing, there's a view out there that women were equal to men in these societies, and Barry Cunliffe, among others, said that that's a misperception because they're only more free than women in the Mediterranean are, for example, Greek and Roman women, by comparison. So maybe a bit uppity by Greek and Roman standards, but as Cunliffe points out, the husband still has the power of life and death over his wife. The law in most of these places allows the wife to be tortured to find out how a husband died. So not exactly equal rights, but maybe a bit uppity by Mediterranean standards. I will say that the ancient sources talk about these women as every bit as tall and strong and athletic as the men. They talk about a society where there's more sexual freedom, and these women have more freedom to be what the Greeks and the Romans would consider to be promiscuous. Certainly there are famous Celtic women warriors, maybe the most famous ever, the warrior Queen Boudica from the British tribes. And remember, these stories may not be true, but they're playing to an audience and their stereotypes. So if I told you this story about a particular Celtic woman, and you heard it, and you said something like, yep, that sounds like what these Celtic women are like. Be careful. Don't marry a Celt. And there you go. I mean, it's a stereotype. One wonders how much of that is true, but that's the image. And by the way, you think of a fiery Irish redhead today in the stereotypes. I mean, when I grew up, this is Maureen O'Hara in The Quiet Man. Just give her a bow and arrow and an axe or a maybe rolling pin and stay out of her way. She could probably kick the hell out of you. One of my favorite stories about Celtic women is the one about Chiamara, or Chiamara is probably closer to the right way to pronounce it. She was a noble woman, not a queen or anything, but a noble woman of a Galatian tribe. And when her tribe was conquered by the Romans, she became a prisoner. And here's the way Diodorus tells the story of Chiamara and her husband, Ortaigon. And, well, I mean, the end message is clear, right? First of all, the audience would listen to this and go, yep, that sounds like a Celtic woman to me. The second one is, they are not to be trifled with, obviously. Diodorus writes, this, by the way, the C.H. Oldfather translation, quote, Chiamara, the wife of Ortaigon, was captured along with the other Galatian women when the Romans under Gnaeus Manlius conquered the Asiatic Galatians. The centurion responsible for her took advantage of his soldierly power and raped her. This man was an ignorant beast who loved both pleasure and money, but in the end, his love of money won out. With a large ransom having been agreed upon, he led her to a certain river, across from agents of her own people. The Galatians crossed over and gave him the money, but after they did so, Kiomara signaled them to strike down the centurion as he was making a friendly farewell. One of her countrymen obeyed and cut off his head. She took the head, wrapped it in her cloak, and went home. When she returned to her husband, she threw the head down at his feet. Ortyagon was amazed and said, "My wife, it is important to deal honorably." "Yes," she said, "but it is more important that only one man who has slept with me should remain alive." End quote. Dang, those Celtic women are fierce. The sack of Rome by the Celtic peoples is more than 300 years before the time period that this story is about to take place in, and a lot has changed. Many of the Celtic groups in other parts of Europe have been pacified, might be the way Caesar would put it, brought under Roman control, their ability to break out and cause destruction in nearby communities curtailed, because if you look at the history of the Celts right after that Battle of the Ilia where Rome is sacked, that's sort of their debut on the historical stage. I like the way H.G. Wells put it. He says that the northern people came down into the light of history for the first time with the Celts. Peter Beresford Ellis puts it this way. He says the Celts were the first European people north of the Alps to emerge into recorded history. Okay, but that emergence comes at the head of armies, and those armies broke into various parts of Europe and caused wide-scale problems for centuries. In 275, they went down there, smashed into Greece, and caused all kinds of problems. The Romans would fight them over and over and over again in various places, winning most, losing some. There would be a big battle that crushed Celtic power in a whole region called the Battle of Telamon in 225 BCE. And that one, the famous accounts say that the problem for the Celts was that they got trapped between two Roman armies coming from different directions. And the highlight of the battle, if you like these sorts of things, is the Celtic army supposedly, if you believe the ancient sources, turning back to back so they could face both armies attacking them at the same time, ferociously falling, basically, almost wiped out. Then when Hannibal and his Carthaginians happen and all these great wars for survival, the ancient version of World War II breaks out, those of course being the world-famous Punic Wars, of which there were 3. The Celtic peoples, for the most part, but not exclusively, that are anywhere nearby, side with Hannibal and look at it as a good way to get back at those Romans, which just makes them seem more dangerous, treacherous, and unreliable to the Romans. After Hannibal's invasion of Italy is beaten back, you get 100 years of Roman conflict with various Celtic peoples. They will play the lead role, but not necessarily the only one, in eliminating Galatian freedom in Asia Minor and that area, in the Balkans also. Although the Galatians had made a lot of enemies and the Romans had plenty of help, most famously from one of the kings fighting the Galatians, where he invited the entire Galatian leadership, supposedly, anyway, this is the story, invites the Galatian leadership to dinner and then massacres them all while they're eating. That's a good way to devastate the command and control of your enemies. The Celtic peoples of northern Italy are defeated and absorbed by the Romans, and that area will become so Roman so quickly they'll start calling that toga-wearing Gaul. The Romans will be forced, basically, that's how they would look at it, to conquer a nice chunk of the south of France from the Celtic peoples there, because it controls access, road access to Spain, and they have to get to Spain now because after the Second Punic War, they're left there with a lot of really ferocious tribes of several different cultures, by the way. Some are Celtic, but some aren't. Some are supposedly a mix. And what do you get when you cross a Celt with an Iberian, a Celtiberian, or a Celtiberian? Nonetheless, The Romans will get involved in a war there that one might compare to a 200-year-long Vietnam War. Guerrilla fighting, atrocities, wholesale massacres, and the disillusionment of some in Rome to this ongoing commitment that they had signed up for that was just draining them. In about the year 115 BCE, which is about 15 years before Julius Caesar's birth, some tribes appear from the north, seemingly out of nowhere. Their origins are not understood, even today, by the way, but their numbers are reportedly outrageously large. Once again, we could filter out all of the exaggerations that have happened at the time and since, and still come to what we must suspect is a larger than normal number, since it's one of the main things that's pointed out continually. Arguments persist on whether or not these people should be called Germanic or Celtic or a mix of the two, because a lot of times where different early European cultures come together, there's like a cultural estuary between them where they mix. We already talked about Celtiberians or Celtiberians. You could have Celto-Germans, Celto-Thracians. Barry Cunliffe is one of those people that keeps trying to point out two things about talking about Celtic people. One, they're different all over the place. Celtic peoples existing in what's now, the modern day area around the Adriatic are not necessarily going to be very much like the ones near modern day Portugal, except that they're all kind of Celtic with local variations. And also that time is elapsing. This idea that barbarians, so-called barbarians, are stuck in neutral in terms of civilizational or political, organizational development is wrong too. They're all in different spots on the scale and all evolving and changing at different speeds. Some of it based on how close you are to more sophisticated civilizations. In this case, these peoples that come down about 115 BCE are always sort of portrayed as a 1 on the Dan Carlin tribal scale. I mean, the most barbarian of the barbarian types, and there's hundreds of thousands of them. Now, if you think about this as a national security problem for the Romans, it's interesting because even today, if you could somehow sneak, let's just play with 200,000 as a round number, 200,000 hostile people right on the border of the United States so that when we wake up one morning, there they are, or they're there in a very short period of time, that would still be a major crisis today. If that's how many people we're talking about in this earlier era, I don't know how they fed them, but you could certainly see how you would have a situation on your hands where the first thing you thought of is, where did these people come from? The second thing you thought of is, what are we going to do about them? And the third thing you thought of is, how do we prevent this from happening again if we don't know what's to the north of us, right? We conquered everything next to us, thought we had a buffer zone, and then these people from the north that we didn't even know about come in and smash right through our buffer zone and threaten Rome itself. Between the years 115 and about 100 BCE, these Teutons and Cimbri and related tribes, as they're called, destroyed Roman army after Roman army. I think the final grand total is something like 4 Roman armies. They scare the heck out of everybody. They march around seemingly going where they want to go and doing what they want to do, raiding here and there, into Roman territory, out of Roman territory, go to Spain for a couple of years, head on back to Italy. Finally, in desperation, the Romans, put this guy in command who had just finished mopping up guerrilla warfare problems in what's now North Africa, famous person in the entire Roman story named Caius Marius, or Caius Marius. Marius, by the way, is the uncle by marriage of Julius Caesar. He's a major player in the final stages of the death throes of the Roman Republic that begin to accelerate and pick up speed with his appearance on the scene. One of the things that Marius famously does before he fights these peoples that have already destroyed 4 Roman armies is change the Roman army. One of the benchmarks in Roman military history is something called the Marian Reforms. Now, to be fair, I've seen some writings out there and some thinking that The guy gets way too much credit for this, for what he did, because what he did, these people would say, was simply codify and formally institutionalize practices the Romans had been doing on an ad hoc basis, improvisationally for decades, filling needs as they came up any way they could. And now Marius was basically saying, oh, you know those things we're doing to fill those needs? Let's just make that how we do it. Nonetheless, I'd say most people still give Caius Marius a ton of credit for taking the late Roman Republican army, and let's be honest and call it what it is, turning it into the first Roman imperial army, because it has imperial problems. And trying to deal with imperial problems with a Republican army has been killing it now for some time, and damaging society, too, in spin-off ways. Marius opens up the legions to everybody. It's no longer based on how much land you own, a farm, your wealth, anything like that. And these people don't go home. They're professionals. It's a permanent army. Now, what this does is completely change the institutional memory of the force. This is something most people don't think about, but I mean, the thing you lose the most when you send the citizen army back home because the war's over is so much of what you learned and the cohesion that you gained from training together. I mean, how much math does your kid forget over the school summer, right? Now magnify that times 1,000. I mean, by keeping an army together all the time, building experience as units, drilling continually and not stopping, you are building capability and institutional memory so that 5 years from now, your cohort is going to be that much better. These Roman armies are a huge leap forward in terms of effectiveness, what they could do on the field, and how much they outclassed the competition. He then took this new model army out and proceeded to butcher, over the course of a couple years, both those tribes and their subsidiary friends that they brought with them. The butchery is supposed to be intense. After all, if you have these massive numbers of people, which made these people so particularly dangerous to begin with, what happens to all of them if you don't kill them? Bellum Romanum, right? War the way the Romans did it, against people they considered to be barbarian. I read one story that said that some of the survivors of one of these battles, where more than 100,000 were supposed to have been left dead on the battlefield, they ran to a nearby Celtic tribe for sanctuary, and the Romans pursued them and told the Celts to turn them over, and when the Celts turned them over, they butchered them on the spot. After one of these battles, supposedly, the peace terms for some of the people that were left over were that 300 of their married wives had to be sold to the Romans as slavery, and in a famous story, the wives reportedly strangled each other to avoid that fate. Now, at the time that Caius Marius is destroying these Germanic or Celtic or Celto-Germanic tribespeople, Caesar's being born. That's the time frame here. So that by the time Caesar is an adult, mature man, trying to argue about, what you do about this problem we have with barbarians north of us, he's able, as are many other generals and politicians, to make use of this deep-seated fear that the Romans have about a potential invasion from the north, one that goes all the way back to the sack of Rome in 390. Here's the way historian Nick Fields explains what the memory of the Cimbri and the Teuton invasion a generation before meant to somebody trying to exploit fears in the Rome of the 50s BCE. He writes, quote, "The vivid memory of the near disaster remained, however, and served as a frightening reminder to Rome that a new northern barbarian threat could suddenly emerge at any time. Barbarian migrations were the stuff of Roman nightmares, and Caesar made good use of it by playing up the, quote, end quote, Germanic menace in his writings. More to the point," he writes, "he also had the wit to revive fears of the Gauls that dated from the sack of Rome in 390 BCE, and advertised them as a race without civilization, who were not above burning alive their prisoners of war." End quote. So in effect, the near disaster against these tribes peoples that were sprung on the Romans unexpectedly was to deepen, widen, and reopen a scar that maybe you could say had been a piece of the Roman psychological reality since at least 390 BCE. And, as early Roman writers kind of said, there's a belief that Rome sort of conquered an empire in self-defense. I think it was Livy who originally threw a version of that line out there, conquering the world in self-defense. But as other historians have pointed out, I read one that he had a great line. He pointed out that, look, Rome is looking for secure borders and